The courtroom was silent as 11-year-old Emily Thompson took the stand. Everyone expected a simple case of fraud. But Emily's words shattered everything. She revealed her father's darkest secrets, and then, to everyone's shock, she exposed her mother's silent complicity. The room was frozen in disbelief. What happened next? It will leave you stunned. Let's start from the beginning. In the heart of a packed Brooklyn courtroom, 11-year-old Emily Thompson sat in the witness chair, visibly trembling. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. This was no ordinary trial. Her father, Richard Thompson, stood accused of high-profile fraud. But the true gravity of the situation was about to shift. The silence in the room deepened as the judge, a stern middle-aged man with graying hair, turned his gaze toward Emily. Beside her, her mother, Karen, lingered in the shadows, her face pale, her expression unreadable. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to be anywhere but here. Karen's hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. The nervous energy radiating off her was palpable, but her eyes were firmly fixed on the ground, unable, or unwilling, to meet her daughter's gaze. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers, but as the attorney called Emily to testify, a chilling silence fell. All eyes were on the young girl who seemed so small in the grand chair that dwarfed her. What could she possibly know about her father's financial dealings? How could a child have any role in such a high-stakes trial? People exchanged doubtful glances, shifting in their seats as Emily nervously clutched the edge of the wooden podium. Emily's brown eyes, wide with fear, scanned the room. She was just a child, yet she had been thrust into this storm of adult drama, a storm that would force her to unveil truths that no one was prepared to hear. Her small frame trembled as she took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together, fingers digging into the skin of her palms as if trying to ground herself in the moment. The once confident young girl had become a shadow of her former self. Her words now seemed like a burden far too heavy for her to carry. But she would carry them because no one else could. Her voice broke the silence, soft and hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each word.
"My dad, he isn't just a bad businessman,"
Emily whispered. A ripple of confusion swept through the room. The prosecutor, Rachel Stewart, leaned forward slightly, a look of curiosity flickering in her eyes. Emily continued, her eyes shifting between the judge and the crowded room, now eerily silent.
"He hurt us. He hurt me. And Mom."
The words hung in the air like a cold, suffocating fog. Gasps filled the room as people tried to process what had just been said. No one had expected this. Fraud, sure, but abuse? This was a whole new level of betrayal, a revelation that shook the very foundation of the trial. Emily's mother stiffened in her corner, her face draining of color, yet she remained silent. Emily's eyes welled with tears, her hands trembling as she recounted the details. The words spilled out, raw and pained, as she revealed the truth behind her family's perfect facade. The life she had known, with its happy moments and public smiles, was a lie. A mask that had hidden the darkness lurking behind closed doors. Her father's actions, more sinister than any financial scheme, had cast a shadow over her life for years. Her voice quivered as she spoke of the fear she had lived with, of the bruises that never seemed to fade, and the whispered threats that followed her into every corner of the house. The courtroom was dead silent, the weight of her confession pressing down on every listener in the room. The audience, once sure that this case was about fraud, was now confronted with something much darker, a secret that had been carefully hidden, buried beneath layers of lies. As Emily's voice faltered, the magnitude of what she had just revealed became undeniable. It wasn't just her father who was on trial. It was the entire life they had built together. Her father, her mother, and herself, caught in a web of deceit,
manipulation, and pain. Emily's courage to speak out was the breaking point, the catalyst that would force the truth into the open. But as her testimony continued, the room held its collective breath. There was more to come. There was always more, and the audience would have to wait. No one yet knew just how deep the story went. The courtroom was thrown into chaos. Emily's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, each one reverberating through the room, causing shockwaves of disbelief. The gasps were loud, sharp, as if no one could believe what they were hearing. The very air seemed to tighten, suffocating under the weight of her confession. Her father, Richard Thompson, whose cool, calculated demeanor had previously dominated the courtroom, now appeared broken. His face, once composed and stern, drained of color as his eyes widened with terror. For the first time in the trial, the mask slipped. He was no longer the untouchable figure, the man who had orchestrated countless deceptions. The truth had struck him like a blow to the gut, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. The defense lawyer, a slick, well-groomed man named James Holden, stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The room could hear his frantic sputtering as he attempted to salvage the situation. "Objection, Your Honor," he stammered, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. He could hardly make his case, much less discredit Emily. His usual confidence had been replaced with a desperate panic, his every word stumbling over the realization that there was no defense against the storm Emily had unleashed. But Emily, despite her small size and young age, stood unwavering. Her shoulders were straight, and her head, though downcast at times, lifted with a quiet strength as the words continued to pour from her lips. She was no longer the frightened girl who had nervously taken the stand. In that moment, she became the voice of truth, unmovable, unflinching, as she spoke of the years of torment and manipulation, of her father's cruelty, of the lies that had surrounded her family like a dark cloud. But it wasn't just her father's betrayal that shook the room. It was the revelation that her mother, Karen, had known all along, and said nothing. Karen, who stood in the back of the room, her arms tightly wrapped around herself, her face pale with the strain of holding everything in, had lived with this secret for years. She had seen the bruises, heard the screams, and yet she had chosen to remain silent. The reason? To protect the family's reputation, to keep up the facade of the perfect family, the successful husband, the loving wife. But the facade had crumbled now, and in its place was the unbearable weight of truth. As Emily spoke, Karen's face contorted in a mixture of shame and fear. Her hands, which had once been clasped tightly together, were now trembling as she wrung them with desperate intensity. The silence she had maintained for so long felt like an anchor, dragging her further into the depths of her own guilt. She had allowed her daughter to suffer in silence, to live in fear, all for the sake of appearances. The prosecutor, Rachel Stewart, who had been watching this unravel with a practiced composure, couldn't hide her shock. Her sharp eyes, which had calculated every move in the courtroom, now betrayed her disbelief. Her jaw was clenched tight, her knuckles white from the tension. The horror of what Emily had just revealed had struck her like a physical blow. She had heard many things in her career, but nothing had prepared her for this. She didn't need to look at the defense anymore. The case had already been shattered by the raw truth in front of her. Rachel's voice, when she finally spoke, was tight with emotion. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her words, "I request that Mrs. Thompson take the stand." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. If Karen took the stand, the full extent of the family's secrets would be exposed. The walls that had been built around the Thompsons were crumbling, piece by piece. But Karen hesitated. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her body was shaking, and though she stood a mere few feet from Emily, the space between them might as well have been miles. As the tears welled in her eyes, her silence spoke volumes of guilt, of fear, and of the unbearable weight of the truth she had been hiding for so long. The courtroom crackled with tension. The air was thick, heavy with anger that swelled with each passing second. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, but the sound was swallowed by the undercurrent of fury building in the room. The trial had shifted. What was once a straightforward case of financial fraud had turned into something far darker, and the betrayal of the Thompson family had ignited outrage among those who had trusted them. There was no going back now. Emily's words had struck a match, and the flames were spreading. Every revelation about her father's abuse, each confession about the life she had endured in silence, fanned the fire of disgust in the courtroom. The whispers among the crowd grew louder, each one filled with judgment and disbelief. How could they have all been so blind? How could they have trusted a man who was capable of such cruelty? The answer was simple. No one had known the truth. And now the truth was impossible to ignore. Rachel Stewart, the prosecutor, seized the opportunity with precision. The moment was hers, and she wasn't going to waste it. With calculated intensity, she moved forward, digging deeper into the murky depths of Richard Thompson's actions. His financial crimes, the reason they were all here in the first place, were nothing compared to the suffocating darkness that had lurked behind closed doors. Rachel laid it all bare. Richard's manipulations, his power, and most importantly, his abusive behavior toward Emily, which had been concealed under the guise of a perfect family. But the revelation wasn't just about Richard. The moment Rachel turned her focus to Karen, the room seemed to hold its breath. Karen, who had watched as her daughter was torn apart by the lies, stood in silence, her face betraying a mixture of shame and fear. Her gaze flitted nervously around the room, never settling on anyone for too long. For years, she had remained silent. She had kept up the charade of the perfect family, her mind twisted by fear and the desire to protect an image that had now shattered beyond repair. Karen's fear turned inward, morphing into something darker. The choice before her was one she had avoided for years. Should she continue to lie, protect her family's reputation, and pretend that she hadn't known? Or should she admit the truth, face the consequences of her actions, and watch everything she had built collapse around her? The courtroom watched as Karen's internal battle played out before them. Her hands trembled at her sides, clenched so tightly that her knuckles went white. The seconds stretched into eternity as she struggled to find the words that would set her free or condemn her forever. Then, finally, Karen's silence broke. Her voice, once so controlled and composed, now cracked with emotion. Anger and regret twisted together, and the words spilled out in a rush. "I was afraid," she cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't know what to do." The admission landed like a punch. The room, once filled with hushed whispers and stifled gasps, became still. But the audience wasn't moved by her confession. They weren't sympathetic. There was no room for empathy in this moment. Too much had been hidden, too many lives shattered. The judge, his face a picture of fury, did not flinch. He slammed his gavel down once more, louder this time, as if to punctuate his disgust. His words were harsh, his voice trembling with emotion as he addressed both Richard and Karen. "You have manipulated not only the justice system but your own daughter. You have stolen her childhood, forced her to carry a burden she should never have had to bear. And now, you stand here, expecting to face no consequences." His voice grew louder, the anger in his words palpable. "You both have betrayed her trust, and there is no escaping that." The judge's words cut through the room like a blade. Richard's face remained impassive, but Karen's shoulders shook with the weight of the truth she could no longer deny. The family, once viewed as the epitome of success,
now stood reduced to a grotesque version of its former self, twisted by lies, betrayals, and the shattered trust of the one person they should have protected most. The courtroom, once buzzing with whispers of admiration for the Thompsons, was now filled with nothing but contempt. The walls that had once surrounded them crumbled, and all that remained was the aftermath of their lies. In the aftermath, the courtroom begins to clear, but the weight of the truth still lingers. Emily's bravery in revealing the truth is praised by the judge, and Richard is taken into custody. Karen, once a pillar of society, faces the collapse of her world. Yet in this moment, Emily finds a sense of relief. The burden of the family secret is no longer hers to carry alone. As the court adjourns, Rachel Stewart approaches Emily, offering her a small smile. "You did what needed to be done," she says, her voice soft. Emily, though exhausted, knows this truth has finally set her free. It will be a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, she is no longer bound by the shackles of family secrets. The burden shifts, and Emily steps out of the courtroom, her future uncertain but unchained. The final words echo through the empty courtroom as the gavel falls one last time, and the truth is accepted. Justice, though delayed, has finally arrived.